Hello everyone, my name is Naya and I will be giving you some information today on resources for deaf and hard of hearing students in public schools. So just to let you know, for the remainder of this presentation, I will be referring to deaf and hard of hearing students as DH8 students. So firstly, I want to start off with the question. So unless you read my lips, you probably had no idea what I just said, right? So I just presented a moment, basically a fraction of what DHA students are presented with while they're in public schools with little to no resources for their disability. So I would like to begin with talking about some resources like teacher training and closed captioning in the classrooms. So when you're in public school, what do you kind of remember? Maybe your relationship with your teacher, right? So imagine being deaf or hard of hearing and not being able to understand what your teacher is saying half the time. So one of the problems in public schools is that regular teachers aren't trained on what to do when they have a DHH student in their class. So some simple trainings would be teaching a teacher not to turn their back or just assume a child can hear simply because they have a hearing aid. Because not all hearing aids work simply by being able to hear. Sometimes they only pick up frequencies or certain sounds. And there's also a need for interpreters and closed captioning because watching videos in class, the pictures move around and sometimes there might be a video showing but there's no one talking. So imagine not being able to hear, you don't really know what's going on in the video, right? So a DHH student won't be able to understand their teacher with their back turned or unless they have closed captioning so that they can gain as much information as possible. So the Academic Speech Language Hearing Association indicates that on an average, children with a mild to moderate hearing loss are likely to be 1 to 4 grades lower than the average hearing child. So during an interview with Ivan Flowers, an interpreter who's worked with both public and deaf schools, we talked about if he saw any effect of DHH students on mainstreaming. And he quoted, "Mainstreaming definitely affected how my students acted in and out of the classroom. You could tell that something was going on once they were returned from their special needs class. I personally think they were being treated as less than because technically they can't fend for themselves, while other special needs children need more attention from the teachers since they can't communicate properly or effectively." So according to the National Association for the Deaf, mainstreaming is when DHH students attend public schools in regular classrooms and are occasionally taken out for additional services. So some of the pros of mainstreaming is that you're allowing your DHH student to be in a public school with other hearing students. But mainstreaming can work in many different ways. For example, there is a program put in place in public schools called the IEP. IEP standing for Individual Education Program. So the IEP in public schools varies from school to school based on their budget and what they're allowed to teach their students. Mainstreaming could be the student can stay in the class for the whole day, and at certain times they're taken out to be interviewed by a speech language pathologist. And there's some times where an interpreter is brought into the class to interpret the little details that the student might have missed if the teacher is going too fast. So Sharon Anita, a graduate of the University of Arizona with a degree in special education, says, "The cons of mainstreaming are that most times when DHH students are picked out of class to be in classes with other special needs children, they aren't given the appreciated attention because they are often seen as cognitively okay. Therefore, if an interpreter or speech language therapist isn't present, the DHH student needs are pushed to the back burner because their disability isn't viewed as severe." So how many of you have heard of the deaf community? Did you know that 28% is made up of people whose parents are completely hearing? So there are several different ways a DHH student education could go simply based on whether their parents are hearing or deaf. So for the first situation, you can have 2 hearing parents. So most of you probably have 2 hearing parents, right? So you most likely went to public school and you didn't have to think about whether or not you would be put into another community where people couldn't hear, right? So DHA students with 2 hearing parents who have a deaf child are most likely to make the decision for their child to go to public schools and most likely have them get a cochlear implant. So does anyone know what a cochlear implant is? One. So cochlear surgery is put into, it's kind of like a brain surgery to help someone who was born deaf hear. So if you have hearing parents, they probably have no idea what the deaf community is, so they are scared that their child won't be they won't feel normal in society since we live in a mostly hearing society. And there's also the situation if one parent is hearing and one parent is deaf. So they're most likely to disagree on how to approach their child's education because one has been part of a deaf community and one has not. So they kind of have to juggle whether or not they want their child to feel normal or whether or not they want their child to kind of engage in what they really are. And lastly, there's a situation of having 2 deaf parents where there's no question they want their child to be a part of the deaf culture, they want their child to use sign language, they don't want their child to be pushed to read lips or think about having to communicate verbally. But ultimately, the decision for DHA students' education comes from their parents. Every family is different, but it's definitely up to the families to make the smartest and safest decisions for their child. So you can see that it's pretty difficult to be a DHA student in public school, right? But lastly, there are things that there's definitely a negative connotation to putting your DHA student in a public school, such as conformity and social integration. So some of the main issues that they go through is if you're deaf and you're put into a class with hearing students, you're probably going to feel like an outcast, just like most special needs children feel. And parents often go through the issues of feeling like they're crippling their child because they don't want them to resent them in the future because they're trying to push sort of this like normal society type of life on their deaf child. But also, if you're hearing, you don't want to push your child into a deaf community and you sociologically don't connect with them. So as you can easily see, it's not easy being a DHH student in society that's built for all hearing people. In conclusion, we've gone over what it's like to be a DHH student, a parent of a DHH student, and what it's like being a DHH student in society. And I would like to close with these remarks. I've told you about how the beginning of having adequate resources for DHH students can start with simple teacher training and closed captioning in the classrooms, the pros and cons of mainstreaming, and what it's like to parent a DHH student. So could you imagine not being able to hear anything your teacher says or be able to look away and write a note down? I hope this information I have provided with you today has let you in on a fraction of the feats DHH people have to overcome while receiving an education. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.